In the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most contested maritime choke points on Earth, a U.S. Navy destroyer carried out routine patrols under standard rules of engagement. The morning haze blurred the horizon, and commercial tankers filled the lanes when radar operators picked up an unexpected track. At first, it looked like a routine flight hugging the Iranian coastline, but within minutes, the aircraft banked sharply and accelerated toward the destroyer. It was not civilian. It was an Iranian military helicopter descending low over the sea, its rotors hammering the air as it closed the gap. On board, combat systems surged into readiness. The ship's Aegis radar confirmed the contact, while close-in weapon systems, rapid-firing defenses designed to shoot down missiles or aircraft at close range, spun to life on standby. Every sailor understood the stakes. In these waters, a miscalculation could trigger a chain reaction reaching far beyond the Gulf. Was this intimidation, reconnaissance, or preparation for something far worse? The helicopter hovered near the threshold of safe distance, daring the crew to respond. And then, just as the Americans held their line, new radar contacts appeared, multiple fast-moving signatures from the Iranian coast. The confrontation had only begun. The Strait of Hormuz has long been one of the most heavily monitored maritime corridors in the world, a narrow waterway where nearly a fifth of the globe's oil supply passes each day, and where every vessel is subject to scrutiny from both regional and international powers. It was in this tense environment that a U.S. Navy destroyer conducting routine patrol operations under standard rules of engagement detected an Iranian military helicopter approaching at low altitude. The initial radar track suggested an ordinary flight along the Iranian coastline, but within minutes, the aircraft shifted course and began closing the distance directly toward the destroyer. The tactical objective for the American crew was clear: maintain position, preserve freedom of navigation, and be ready to identify whether the inbound aircraft represented a reconnaissance attempt, a warning gesture, or a genuine threat. Environmental conditions made the task even more complex. The narrow sea lanes were crowded with commercial shipping. Radio frequencies carried heavy static from competing transmissions, and visibility was hazed by morning humidity rising from the water. Against this backdrop, the sudden approach of a fast-moving rotary aircraft demanded immediate attention. Combat Information Center operators quickly transitioned from general surveillance to focused tracking. The ship's phased array radar refined the contact, confirming it was not a civilian helicopter, but a military platform with maneuvering behavior inconsistent with benign transit. Sonar and surface search channels reported no immediate additional threats, but the possibility of a coordinated action could not be dismissed. The command team initiated a layered response, beginning with electronic signals to establish identification protocols, followed by secure voice warnings transmitted over international guard frequencies. Sailors on the flight deck visually acquired the helicopter, noting its altitude had dropped to a dangerously low level above the waves, a classic tactic to complicate radar lock and reduce reaction time. The destroyer's Aegis combat system was placed on higher readiness, weapon directors aligning toward the contact to demonstrate that engagement could occur without delay. Close-in weapon systems, or CIWS, which are rapid-firing gun turrets designed to intercept missiles or aircraft at short range, were cycled to standby, their distinctive whirring motors a physical reminder to the crew that lethal force was only one order away. Every movement was reported with precision, the chain of command balancing the need for restraint with the obligation to protect the ship and its personnel. The destroyer had encountered tense moments before, but the deliberate closing maneuver by this Iranian helicopter suggested an attempt to probe U.S. reaction times and rules of engagement. As the helicopter hovered near the threshold of internationally recognized safe distance, the U.S. crew maintained their disciplined posture. The immediate outcome was a standoff that never erupted into open fire, but the implications went far beyond that morning in the Strait. Analysts would later argue whether the maneuver was meant to intimidate, to test radar tracking envelopes, or to collect targeting data under the guise of a close pass. What mattered in the moment was the razor-thin margin between control and catastrophe. The American destroyer had successfully deterred escalation by displaying readiness without triggering it. Yet the crew understood that restraint was not a guarantee of future safety. The situation had stabilized for the moment, but as electronic surveillance screens flickered and operators cross-checked for additional contacts, A deeper unease settled across the command deck, because just as the helicopter began to peel away, new signals emerged on the radar horizon, and the destroyer's officers realized this encounter was only the opening act of a much larger challenge. The Iranian helicopter had pulled away, but its sudden retreat was not the end of the encounter. On the destroyer's radar scopes, operators detected multiple new tracks forming along the edge of the detection envelope, each one appearing and disappearing in the background noise before resolving into distinct contacts. These were not civilian airliners or merchant vessels. They were fast, erratic signatures consistent with unmanned aerial vehicles and light fixed-wing aircraft launched from the Iranian coastline. The tactical situation changed in seconds. What had begun as a single close pass by a helicopter was quickly evolving into a layered demonstration of force. The immediate objective for the destroyer was to hold defensive posture, maintain freedom of navigation, and assess whether the approaching swarm was a reconnaissance probe or the opening move in a harassment campaign. The crew felt the shift instantly. The calm tension of the earlier standoff gave way to a sharper edge, with every station bracing for the possibility that the next decision would be measured in seconds rather than minutes. Within the Combat Information Center, the phased array radar began tracking the incoming drones with greater precision. Operators fed targeting data into the Aegis system, which can simultaneously track and engage dozens of aerial threats. The ship's electronic warfare suite came online, scanning the spectrum for command signals that could reveal control links between the drones and their operators on shore. On the bridge, officers reviewed the rules of engagement once again, knowing that the threshold for firing would depend on both proximity and hostile intent. Over secure voice channels, repeated warnings were issued in clear language, ordering the approaching aircraft to alter course. No response came back. Visual lookouts reported glints on the horizon, small shapes cutting low across the water in a deliberate attempt to complicate defensive tracking. To counter this, the destroyer shifted speed and heading slightly, creating a better firing angle for the ship's defensive weapons without yielding its patrol station. The Sea Sparrow launchers were tested for readiness, while the close-in weapon systems were adjusted to lock parameters for small aerial targets. Each step was deliberate, each order delivered with the knowledge that the margin for error was shrinking as the drones continued to close the gap. The helicopter had set the stage, but the real pressure was arriving in the form of these low-flying, unmanned aircraft that could be carrying cameras or explosives, and the crew had no way of knowing which until they came closer. As the drones entered the outer perimeter of the destroyer's defensive bubble, alarms sounded across the ship, signaling that time had run out for negotiation. The first wave of contacts was now within engagement range, and commanders had to decide whether to open fire or risk being caught unprepared. The tactical reality was harsh. Even a single drone could cause damage if it struck sensitive equipment or forced evasive maneuvers in a crowded shipping lane. The ship's systems were aligned, weapons directors tracking, radars updating, and gunners standing ready. For the sailors on deck, every sound of the engines and every flicker on the radar screen carried the weight of imminent confrontation. The outcome of this opening move was still uncertain, but what was clear was that the Iranian forces were escalating the encounter from a symbolic flyby to a tangible aerial pressure test. And just as the destroyer's combat system prepared to authorize its first intercepts, operators reported a sudden spike of signals from the east, suggesting that an even larger wave of incoming contacts was forming beyond the horizon. The sudden surge of drone signals on the destroyer's radar screens transformed the atmosphere on board from measured vigilance into controlled urgency. The commanding officer gave the order to elevate the ship's defense posture, and every system moved in synchronization toward the single objective of denying the enemy any chance to penetrate the protective envelope. The Aegis combat system began assigning firing solutions, correlating radar tracks with electro-optical sensors, and distributing target data to the layered weapons network. The destroyer's crew understood the stakes. In the confined waters of the Strait of Hormuz, where commercial tankers and smaller dhows filled the lanes, a single missed intercept could mean collateral damage or worse, a chain reaction of panic across civilian shipping. With the Iranian drones closing distance, the tactical objective was no longer just deterrence. It was the immediate preservation of the ship, its crew, and the freedom of passage through one of the most contested waterways on Earth. The first defensive line came in the form of electronic warfare countermeasures. The ship's jamming suite emitted controlled bursts across known frequencies used for drone command links, attempting to sever the connection between operator and machine. Several of the incoming tracks began to wobble, their flight paths erratic as they lost stable guidance. But not all succumbed to the interference. The more advanced drones pressed forward, relying on pre-programmed navigation rather than remote control. To deal with them, the destroyer launched a pair of SM-2 surface-to-air missiles, sleek white contrails ripping into the morning sky as the ship's vertical launch cells discharged with thunderous concussion. The missiles arced upward before diving on their targets, radar guidance ensuring precision. 2 drones disintegrated into fragments, falling harmlessly into the sea. Almost simultaneously, the ship's Sea Sparrow launchers engaged, streaking out in close-range intercepts that eliminated 2 more contacts in a sharp burst of controlled fire. The noise was deafening, the deck vibrating under the force of rapid launches, yet the crew operated with methodical precision, every sequence executed as rehearsed countless times in drills. Still, the pressure did not ease. Several drones slipped through the outer layers and entered the engagement range of the close-in weapon systems. The automated Gatling guns spun to life, barrels glowing as they unleashed walls of depleted uranium rounds. Tracer fire lit the air, carving lines of incandescent orange against the gray backdrop of the sky. One drone erupted in flames, another splashed into the sea in a plume of water. The ship remained intact, but the fight was far from over. In the moments following the initial wave of intercepts, the crew felt the weight of both relief and unease. The countermeasures had worked, proving the layered defense doctrine sound under real pressure, but the sheer volume of contacts and the persistence of those that survived jamming suggested something more deliberate than a mere harassment sortie. Operators reported that new signals were materializing just beyond the radar horizon, and the specter of another larger wave began to form in the minds of the command staff. The realization spread quickly. This was not an isolated test, but a structured escalation, a probing of every layer of the destroyer's defenses. Each intercept bought time, but also revealed to the adversary how the ship responded under stress, what frequencies it jammed first, how fast it launched missiles, how close it allowed drones to approach before opening fire. The Iranian forces were not simply pressing with machines, they were gathering intelligence in real time. And as the last wreckage of the intercepted drones settled into the waves, the destroyer's radar operators called out a chilling update. Larger air contacts had just lit up on their scopes, inbound at higher speed and greater altitude, signaling that the next stage of the confrontation was about to begin. The destroyer's radar picture shifted abruptly as larger air contacts emerged at higher altitude, moving with greater speed than the drones that had just been neutralized. These new signals were not erratic. They were deliberate and coordinated, flying in formation patterns that suggested either manned fighter aircraft or advanced unmanned strike platforms dispatched to intensify the pressure. The atmosphere in the Combat Information Center hardened into one of grim calculation. The immediate tactical objective was clear: sustained defensive posture against a potential second wave that could not only test the ship's systems, but deliver an actual strike. Unlike the drones, these tracks carried the weight of higher payload capacity and faster closure rates, meaning the window for reaction was narrower. Outside, the horizon appeared deceptively calm. Tankers continued their transit through the choke point, and civilian mariners remained unaware that a naval flashpoint was unfolding beside them. Inside the destroyer, every operator and officer knew that the balance between restraint and survival was narrowing to the thinnest of margins. The Aegis combat system automatically prioritized the new contacts, assigning engagement sequences in parallel to ongoing surveillance of the remaining drones that had not been destroyed. Radar operators refined track quality, feeding data into fire control channels, while the ship's electronic warfare team attempted to identify emission profiles that might confirm the type of aircraft inbound. The command staff considered the rules of engagement carefully, weighing whether these new signals could still be interpreted as intimidation flights or whether they now represented imminent threat. Secure communications crackled with updates from regional command authorities, but decision-making rested with the destroyer's captain, who bore the responsibility of timing every escalation precisely. On the deck, sailors repositioned for possible launch operations, securing gear and preparing for the deployment of the MH-60 Seahawk helicopter if air interception or search and rescue became necessary. Weapon crews checked readiness on both vertical launch cells and short-range interceptors. The tension was no longer theoretical. The destroyer was bracing for contact with faster and more dangerous aircraft that could appear over the horizon in minutes. Every system was tuned to maximum readiness, radars cycling, launchers primed, gunners at stations. The psychological weight was immense because each operator knew that a wrong call could either trigger unnecessary escalation or invite a devastating first strike from the enemy. When the first of the high-speed contacts broke through the horizon, visual lookouts confirmed they were Iranian Su-22 fighter jets, aging but still capable of carrying heavy ordnance and unguided rockets. Their sudden appearance transformed the engagement from a drone harassment exercise into a high-stakes standoff between a modern guided missile destroyer and strike aircraft capable of delivering real damage. The Su-22s executed aggressive maneuvers, diving low over the water and then climbing sharply, a display designed to demonstrate capability and test the destroyer's fire discipline. The ship maintained radar lock, missiles standing by in launch tubes, but the order to fire had not yet been given. Each second dragged under unbearable pressure, sailors tracking the jet's movements while knowing that any one of them could unleash ordnance within seconds. The destroyer's commander chose restraint, signaling again through secure channels, broadcasting warnings, and illuminating the aircraft with targeting radars to demonstrate that the ship was fully prepared to engage. The outcome hung in balance. The jets peeled off after a tense circuit, but radar operators then detected additional signals rising from inland air bases, suggesting that what the crew had just endured was not the climax, but the precursor to an even broader aerial escalation. The appearance of the Iranian strike aircraft marked the most dangerous phase of the confrontation, but it also provided the destroyer with the clarity to act decisively. The drones had been a test of endurance and electronic warfare, but fighter jets carried the potential for direct attack, and the command team understood that hesitation could mean disaster. The order went through the ship to prepare a layered response that would not only deter, but if necessary, neutralize any incoming ordnance. Radar tracking intensified as the Su-22s maneuvered aggressively, and the Aegis combat system generated continuous fire control solutions. The crew felt the weight of expectation, the knowledge that the ship's survival and the preservation of the sea lane depended on precise execution. The Strait of Hormuz remained crowded with civilian vessels, but the destroyer was committed to protecting its patrol station while showing both adversary and allies that the U.S. Navy would not yield. Every sailor sensed that the moment had come when restraint had to be balanced with unmistakable strength. The escalation began when one of the Iranian aircraft dived toward the sea surface in what looked like a potential attack run. The destroyer's commander immediately authorized a defensive intercept, and a Standard Missile-2 roared from its vertical launch cell, trailing fire and smoke as it accelerated to supersonic speed. The missile guided straight toward the inbound jet, and the hostile aircraft broke away before release, banking hard and abandoning its attack vector. The demonstration was enough. The jet retreated, leaving the sea behind it boiling with its afterburner. Almost simultaneously, electronic warfare operators picked up new signals indicating that the remaining aircraft were probing, but not committing, holding at the edge of engagement range as if reassessing their options. To reinforce the message, the destroyer launched its MH-60 Seahawk helicopter, which climbed swiftly and took position as an airborne extension of the ship's sensors and weapons. The presence of the Seahawk, armed with air-to-air missiles and surveillance systems, widened the defensive umbrella and complicated any further hostile maneuvering. At the same time, the destroyer cycled its CIWS to active scanning mode, their distinctive tracking noises filling the decks with a sense of imminent readiness. Each component of the layered defense network was now visibly and audibly alive, a full orchestration of deterrence designed to communicate that the ship would not be intimidated into retreat or hesitation. The tide of the engagement shifted slowly but unmistakably. The Iranian aircraft, denied a simple harassment run and confronted by a wall of integrated defenses, began to peel away in pairs, retreating toward the coast rather than press into the destroyer's engagement zone. The remaining drones that had survived the earlier intercepts loitered briefly, but the Seahawk and the ship's electronic jamming pushed them off course until they lost coordination and drifted away. For the crew, the relief was tempered by the awareness that what had just unfolded was more than an isolated skirmish. It was a deliberate test, probing every layer of their defensive architecture, measuring reaction times, weapon choices, and rules of engagement under pressure. The destroyer had prevailed, turning a moment of near escalation into a demonstration of discipline and capability. But operators on the radar deck were already calling out new developments. Signals of surface vessels leaving Iranian ports began to appear, their courses uncertain, and the officers on the bridge realized that even as the airspace cleared, the confrontation at sea was preparing to shift domains. As the Iranian aircraft faded from radar and the skies above the Strait of Hormuz grew quiet once more, the focus of the destroyer's combat team shifted seaward. New surface contacts had begun appearing, small vessels departing from Iranian ports and moving into the shipping lanes with courses that were ambiguous and speeds that varied erratically. On radar, they looked like the countless fishing dhows and patrol boats that filled these waters every day, but the context of the preceding hours left no doubt that they could serve as secondary pressure points. The tactical objective for the destroyer was now to secure its immediate waters, deter any surface harassment, and ensure that commercial shipping continued without disruption. The challenge was compounded by the density of maritime traffic, the interference of coastal radar reflections, and the reality that hostile craft often disguise themselves as civilian vessels until the moment of action. Against this backdrop, the destroyer's command team prepared for what could become the final phase of the confrontation, a test not of missiles and jets, but of close-range seamanship and judgment under pressure. The ship's sensors tracked the incoming vessels with precision, fusing radar signatures with infrared imagery and optical confirmation from deck lookouts. Several of the small craft were operating in loose formation, edging closer to the destroyer while ignoring repeated hails over international radio channels. The crew had seen this pattern before in the Gulf. Swarm tactics, where multiple small boats close in simultaneously to harass or even attempt to disable a larger warship. The destroyer responded by launching warning flares and maneuvering into a position that maximized fields of fire without endangering civilian shipping nearby. Its 5-inch deck gun was loaded with high explosive rounds, elevation shifting smoothly to track potential threats, while heavy machine guns were manned along the rails. The MH-60 Seahawk helicopter, still airborne from its earlier sortie, repositioned to monitor the small craft from above, feeding live video back to the Combat Information Center. Electronic warfare operators monitored communications chatter on maritime bands, listening for coordination signals that might betray hostile intent. The tension on board rose steadily as the boats closed distance, their silhouettes clear against the shimmering surface of the water. Orders were relayed firmly. Maintain discipline, hold fire until intent was unmistakable, but be ready to execute instantly should aggression be confirmed. The outcome crystallized when several of the Iranian fastboats surged forward at speed, cutting across the destroyer's bow in a maneuver designed to provoke and unsettle. The commander gave the order, and the 5-inch gun fired a warning shot that landed with a towering splash just ahead of the lead craft. Simultaneously, machine gunners opened with short bursts into the waterline, creating a curtain of fire that made the message impossible to misinterpret. The boats wavered, engines roaring as they scattered and turned back toward the coastline. The immediate danger receded, but the confrontation had made its point. The destroyer had demonstrated the full spectrum of layered defense, from electronic jamming and missile intercepts to deck guns and helicopter overwatch. Yet the crew knew that deterrence was not permanent. Each phase of the engagement had escalated in deliberate sequence, probing air, sea, and electronic domains. What ended with small boats fleeing into the distance could just as easily have tipped into open conflict had a single decision been mistimed. The destroyer's radar screens cleared, the waters around it returned to uneasy normalcy, and civilian shipping resumed its passage. But the crew's silent understanding was that the calm was temporary. In the Strait of Hormuz, the line between routine patrol and sudden combat was always razor thin, and tonight they had only just held it. The confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz showed how fragile security remains in one of the world's most critical waterways. What began with an Iranian helicopter evolved into waves of drones, strike aircraft, and fast boats pressing dangerously close to a U.S. Navy destroyer. Each stage forced the crew to balance restraint with readiness, proving their discipline under constant pressure. The destroyer prevailed without triggering uncontrolled escalation, but the incident underscored how quickly routine patrols can spiral toward crisis. Modern naval warfare is now defined less by decisive fleet battles and more by sudden encounters measured in seconds. Drone incursions, electronic interference, and ambiguous small craft create uncertainty that demands instant judgment. Commanders must identify hostile intent immediately while protecting civilian shipping nearby. Adversaries exploit this tension, using harassment not only to intimidate, but also to collect intelligence on U.S. reaction times, weapons use, and engagement rules. Each encounter becomes both a test and a rehearsal for larger conflicts that may erupt without warning. For the United States and its allies, the lesson is clear. Vigilance and restraint must exist alongside readiness to act. In the Strait of Hormuz, discipline and resolve remain the final barrier between peace and war. If you believe stories like this matter and that we must understand modern war before it happens again, subscribe, like, and comment to support the channel.